Before whales roamed the seas, before sharks ruled coral reefs, before vertebrates had even figured out how to live on land, there was a fish. Not the kind you're picturing. This wasn't a trout. It wasn't a sleek predator like a tuna or a barracuda. It was an animal so heavily built, so biologically strange, that if it were alive today, we might not even recognize it as a fish at all. Its skull was armored like medieval plate, its body likely sluggish and dense, and its jaws operated more like shears than teeth. It was a species that didn't just feed, it reshaped everything else around it. This was Dunkleosteus, one of the most powerful predators the oceans have ever produced. To understand Dunkleosteus, we need to rewind roughly 360 million years, to a period scientists call the Devonian. Often nicknamed the Age of Fishes, it was a chapter in Earth's history when aquatic life underwent an explosion in diversity and complexity. Jawed fish were appearing in large numbers, experimenting with size, armor, and hunting strategies. Coral reefs, although built from very different organisms than today's corals, stretched across shallow marine shelves. These warm, murky coastal seas teemed with life, much of it strange to modern eyes. On land, however, life was still finding its footing. Plants had only recently evolved true root systems, which allowed them to grow larger and anchor themselves into soil. Primitive vascular plants like Rhynia and Zosterophyllum were spreading slowly, forming low-lying greenery in otherwise barren landscapes. The first wingless insects had just appeared, crawling among the early flora. Vertebrates wouldn't begin colonizing land for several million more years. The continents, for the most part, were quiet. But as for the oceans, those were changing rapidly. Marine life in the Devonian was dominated by placoderms, an extinct class of armored fishes. These animals were characterized by bony plates covering their heads and thoraxes, leaving the back half of their bodies more flexible and cartilaginous. Dunkleosteus was one of the largest and most advanced of these. Estimates suggest it could grow up to 10 meters in length, though most specimens were likely smaller, perhaps 6 to 8 meters long on average. Its body shape is still a matter of scientific interpretation. Most of what we know about Dunkleosteus comes from its skull and jaw plates, which fossilized well due to their density. The rest of its skeleton, made largely of cartilage, has rarely been preserved. Artists and paleontologists have pieced together reconstructions based on related species like Dunkleosteus and comparisons with modern sharks. These reconstructions typically show a large-headed animal with a tapered, muscular body capable of short bursts of speed. Its most defining feature, however, was its jaws. Unlike sharks, which use rows of serrated teeth, Dunkleosteus relied on sharpened jaw plates, large bones that grew continuously and ground against each other each time the mouth opened or closed. Over time, this motion honed the edges like a self-sharpening blade. These weren't teeth in the traditional sense, but they served the same function, cutting, shearing, and splitting prey open with extraordinary force. Modern biomechanical modeling has estimated Dunkleosteus's bite force at over 8,000 pounds per square inch, among the strongest of any known fish, living or extinct. This pressure, combined with the animal's ability to open its jaws in just 20 milliseconds, suggests a highly efficient method of ambush predation. It would have created suction to draw prey in, then brought down the bladed jaws in a quick, decisive motion. The result wasn't just injury, it was destruction. Armor, cartilage, bone, none of it offered much resistance to the bite of the Dunkleosteus. These capabilities aren't just theoretical. Fossils of other placoderms have been found with bite marks that match the shape and size of Dunkleosteus jaws. In one notable specimen, a deep semicircular gouge was discovered in the skull of another Dunkleosteus, showing clear signs of healing. This suggests that intraspecific combat may have been common, whether over territory, dominance, or access to mates. Another site revealed fragmented placoderm bones clustered together, bearing multiple parallel gouges. It's believed to have been a feeding site, where a large predator repeatedly attacked and fed on armored prey. The angle and depth of the wounds pointed again toward Dunkleosteus. And these aren't isolated incidents. Paleontologists have found similar trauma patterns in multiple locations, suggesting that Dunkleosteus was not a rare anomaly. It was widespread, and it had a profound impact on its environment. For over 20 million years, Dunkleosteus sat at the top of the food chain. No known predator rivaled its size or power. Smaller armored fishes may have developed tougher plating in response. Early sharks likely became faster and more evasive. Trilobites, which had existed for hundreds of millions of years, faced new pressure to burrow, hide, or relocate. The presence of Dunkleosteus would have shaped ecosystems across wide areas, much like apex predators do today. This kind of evolutionary arms race has repeated throughout history. When a predator reaches the top, it forces every other species to adapt, sometimes through speed, sometimes through defense, sometimes by retreating into ecological niches that the predator can't reach. Dunkleosteus was likely one of the first species to drive this kind of widespread adaptation at such a large scale. It's not just a story of power, it's a story of influence, of how one animal changed everything around it simply by existing. Dunkleosteus was large, heavily built, and dependent on a steady diet of other vertebrates. When environmental conditions shifted, its survival became much harder. The late Devonian extinction was not a single cataclysm, but rather a series of prolonged ecological disruptions. Reef systems collapsed. Oxygen levels in shallow waters dropped. The stability of the food web began to unravel. Smaller, more flexible species were able to adapt. Early sharks, once relegated to the margins, survived these changes and began to thrive. Lighter and faster, they could fill ecological roles that Dunkleosteus simply couldn't. Meanwhile, Dunkleosteus and other large placoderms began to disappear from the fossil record. Their size, once an advantage, had become a burden. They required more food than the oceans could offer. Their specialized anatomy, once so efficient, left little room for flexibility. And so, the first great apex predator vanished. The disappearance of Dunkleosteus cleared the way for a new wave of marine predators. Sharks, having avoided direct competition, filled the empty space left behind. They would go on to diversify into the many forms we know today, from filter-feeding giants like Rhincodon typus to agile hunters like Carcharodon carchareus. The ocean would never return to the placoderm-dominated ecosystems of the Devonian. That chapter had ended. It's an echo we've seen again and again in natural history. When the dominant predator falls, something else rises to take its place. And often, what rises is something more adaptable, less specialized, something that watched quietly from the edges and waited for its moment. Today, all that remains of Dunkleosteus are the front pieces, its skull and jaw plates. The rest of its body, made of cartilage, rarely fossilized. But even those fragments are enough to tell its story. The sheer weight of the bone, the curvature of the jaw, the wear patterns from thousands of kills, all of it points to an animal designed not just to survive, but to dominate. Its fossils are found in Europe, North America, and parts of Morocco, often in marine sedimentary layers that mark what were once shallow seas. The rock around it may be gray or tan now, but 360 million years ago, that sediment was teeming with life, and Dunkleosteus was its top predator. Even incomplete, the evidence is compelling. The bones don't just describe anatomy, they describe behavior. They show us an animal that hunted with speed and power, left scars in its wake, and ultimately outgrew its world. When people think of prehistoric predators, they often jump straight to the dinosaurs, T-Rex, Velociraptor, or later, Megalodon. But Dunkleosteus came before all of them. It lived in a time when the rules of life were still being written, and it helped shape those rules. It didn't roar, it didn't run. It moved through water like a machine, armored, precise, and endlessly hungry. In the silence of the Devonian seas, it was the first to define what it meant to rule. And when it was gone, the ocean moved on. But its legacy remains.